Well, hey there, heroes. It's David H. Lawrence the 17th. Thank you so much for joining me. It's a lovely day here. My phone is telling me that it's sunny out. I wouldn't know. I haven't been out of the house in about 3 years. Ladies and gentlemen, look who just joined me on the screen. Mr. Jim Johnson and Mr. Dan O'Day. That's
Howdy.
great.
Hey there.
Jim, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's actually a little bit of a coolish day where I'm at today.
Hmm.
I'll
It's
take
been it's been cool and wet here too. I don't understand this. It's driven Los Angeles people out of their minds.
it.
Rain.
There was a time in past years, past decades, when every year it would rain the month of March in Los Angeles and not the rest of the year at all.
Huh.
Things were nice and predictable.
Got it. And now?
And now it's just complete havoc. It's everything goes higgly-piggly that's the weather term.
Okay, great. Listen, we've got people that are joining us. Let me know where you're watching from. We're on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. We also want to know what your questions are going to be for Jim Johnson, because we've got this very narrow window. Jim is very much in demand. And, oh, there's the acting police. Awesome. So if you have questions about accents and dialects, and I got to tell you, I made the mistake this morning of sending out an email to people saying, "Hey, if you can't make it this afternoon, we'll have a replay, and we will also take your questions. If you can't make it, just send them to me via email or via your favorite social traffic pattern, and I will ask them for you." And we got a bunch of questions, but I also want to thank you, Michael, from Columbus, Ohio. Really? Upper Arlington, German Village, downtown. What are you doing? Michael Bruce says, "Oh, Michael Barone, Mr. Barone, how are you, sir? Wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that was back in the 80s when I had a very different life. Okay, New York City, awesome. So people coming in from all over the place. If you have questions, you get priority if you're here live. If you're watching the replay and you sent me a question, I'm going to do the best I can to get to that question. But I do want to let you know that we're here for a very particular reason, and that is that the accents class, Jim's class with Dan on accents and dialects, how to add those to your performer tool belt, is open for registration right now. And as we're recording this, and maybe within the first day of watching the replay, if you see this and you act before Tuesday night, March 28th, 2023, at 9 p.m. Pacific, Dan will reach into his wallet, which is a burgeoning little device, and take out $300, plop it down on the table, and pay for your first $300 of the course, but only if you register at the link that you see on the screen, which is voheroes.com/accents. I'll remind you of that during the course of the show. Let's see what else is going on here. I'm going to start things off by asking a question. When it came in, it was something that I have. Let me just find it here. I want to make sure I have the. Aha. Okay. So I encountered this when I was doing an audiobook, and we will get to everybody's credits and everybody's reason for being here as we do the show. Just suffice it to say that Jim Johnson is a rock star. If you've seen the videos that I sent out over the last week, you saw what he did to, shut up a whole bunch of native Irish people about accents. But this particular question that came in, I believe from Crystal Polon, was something that I encountered when I was doing an audiobook, and I had to do a street preacher, an African-American. I am not African-American, but like any other acting job, it just struck me as something that I needed to do. And Crystal kind of put it in an interesting way. How do you avoid slipping into caricature or offensive stereotypes when using accents and dialects? When I did it, I thought, oh man, I hope a reviewer doesn't say, who is this guy to be doing Black people, creating Black people's caricatures. So, Jim, what do you have to say on that?
Well, I've kind of got a couple of different answers on that. One of them is that there's a degree of leaning into elements of an accent that you need to do in the beginning when you're learning it so that you can get that element. And that can feel like you are leaning into almost a cartoon or caricature at moments so that you can figure out, for example, the intonation, the musicality of it. Leaning into it is really useful. And then what it needs to become is it needs to become owned, and it needs to be like done from sort of generosity of soul and connection with the human being. So it's got to be guided by, if you're talking about something like audiobooks where you're needing to pop in and out of different characters, it's got to, in the end, be about the storytelling and the humanity. And I think that's the important thing, is making sure that the storytelling and the humanity is at the center of it. And that's part of my preaching too, is with accents, if it's in a, whether it's in a play or a film, is that in the end, you've got to end up telling the story. So you got to be clear and understandable while also trying to let people know where you're from so they get the proper information, and you're not getting in the way of the storytelling by doing a disconnected accent, something that's not genuine, and doing it with a whole human in mind.
Yeah. So put yourself, and you have, because you're a trained actor, put yourself in the position of being given lines that are caricature-like.
Yeah.
You know, maybe they are sarcastic, or maybe they are, but they are in a caricature that includes, or they're in a character that includes an accent or dialect that could be, in today's society, considered to be a little racist if you do it and you're not that particular race or nationality. When that feeling sort of creeps over you, can you give me a phrase to use or some sort of attitude to use to like quiet that down so that you can just get on with the acting?
Again, I think it's about taking it back to the humanity. But, well, frankly, I mean, you're really setting it up with the story that you're telling me right now about the like the lines or the stereotype and all of that stuff. Honestly, I question whether I'm doing that project.
Really?
I'm actually right now, so I just got contacted by a theater company that does some very edgy work, and I am going to be doing some coaching for them. And some of the things that they're doing are over the top. And I recognize, so I had to have a conversation with them about, okay, what is it you're after here? I was really trying to get at, are they coming at it from a place of I'm going to use generosity of spirit in order to tell a certain story that I think is a useful story. And I think that it is, which is why I'm like, yes, I'm ready to work with you on this. We need to recognize where and how this is happening. But I have turned down some things where I go, I'm not cool with this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, David, could I throw in a couple of additional things?
Yeah,
there?
let me just wrap up just so
Sure.
you know, Jim is classically trained in Shakespeare, has done lots and lots of work with big projects, big production numbers, etc. And we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of creating accents and being consistent with accents. We're going to do some technical things, but the joy of the accents class is that he brings this background that is very much like us. You know, he's not just a simple linguistics professor that walks in and says, you need to understand what rhotic means and where the placement in your mouth is. He does that, but he also gets us. So that's what I think made the accent class so great for me. So Dan, go ahead.
Well, just hearkening back to your original question, and one of these, one or both of these I learned from Jim. Depending on the medium, let's say if it's audiobooks, and we got a lot of audiobook narrators in the audience here, and I learned this from Jim, it's really important to remember when you are narrating an audiobook, every word out of your mouth doesn't have to sound like you are living in that country that the accent represents. All you need to do is give hints. So in an entire sentence, there might be one word, there might be a syllable. And so you don't have to, that's one. hints. Just so it's like in America, you know, I'm sure other people feel the same way. If I'm watching something on TV and it seems to be an American, and the guy says, "Oh, gee, what time is it? Oh, it's about 3:00. Oh, I just got the hint. He's Canadian, because how he said about everything else sounds the way we speak. The second thing is that also I learned from Jim about accents, and also one of the things I learned in radio in terms of doing comedy and big stuff is it's a heck of a lot easier to reel you back in than to reel you out. So when Jim talks about start big, you know, you might start caricaturish, cartoonish, and it might be offensive if someone were to hear it. But if they don't hear it and you keep whittling it back until now you're just at the percentage you want, it makes life so much easier.
And I will say, kind of I was going to say right along that line, oftentimes I just had somebody contact me and say, what we want to do is a light accent. And the thing that they have to understand is that doing a light accent is actually a little harder than doing a heavier accent.
Yeah.
And that's because you need to take the journey through a heavier version of the accent to actually reach a lighter version, because you've got to take things to the extreme so that you really get the different sounds, the placement, the intonation, these different elements of it. You've got to do a strong version in order to get to the light version. Otherwise, what it ends up becoming is a muddled mess.
Yeah. The work that we do as actors is no different here. When I approach an accent or dialect, I just did an audition for what's called a dual POV narration audiobook, where one of the protagonists is a hunky Australian guy. And the scene that they gave us was not an intense, emotional scene. It was kind of like he was bemused about everything. And so working into the accent and then working backwards in terms of the energy level back to the appropriate service to the story, where he was just kind of like hanging out, and it wasn't anything to push, was again something that I learned from you in terms of, really explore the accent and then pull back to where you need to be to serve the story. So I said we would give priority to people who showed up live. So let's see what Michael asks. Asking as a writer of scripts, do you prefer as a voice actor to have accents phonetically represented, or do you prefer just a direction like Southern Belle? Answering for myself, I would prefer that you stay as far away from giving me the line read as you possibly can. I don't want you to tell me how to do the work. And I can tell you that most of the time I am cast as a Southern Belle. So, but Jim, what do you think? What are your choices?
I'm going to agree with the same thing. I mean, there's some word choice that should inform it, but playwright George Bernard Shaw really commonly writes out, especially the first appearance of a certain character who's got a stronger accent. He will write it out in his attempt at describing it. And oftentimes it's not really accurate. It's problematic. And it's actually, sometimes it's deciphering it to go, what the heck is it you're having this character say? So it becomes a pain in the butt when it's written out in this sort of phonemic attempt.
Phonemic. That sounds like bereft of phonemes. It's a combination of phonemes and anemic. But Dan, you were going to say something?
It's also if you're writing something, if you spell out the words phonetically to represent that accent, it's very difficult for the performer to read that, because what you're seeing is if you see the word tomato, okay, look, tomato, great. But if you see TAH dash, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you got to take a moment to translate it. And that's exhausting, and it's harder to remember.
Yeah.
And it takes longer to learn.
And it brings up an interesting point. You said George Bernard Shaw, who, if I'm not mistaken, hasn't written much lately. But he's
tweeting a lot.
He is. He's you know what? I can't get out of his tweets are ending up in my feed far more often than Elon Musk's are, which I have a problem with. But what it brings up is an issue that I was asked a question about this just a couple weeks ago. When you're dealing with historical versions of accents and dialects that may have changed over time or don't really exist anymore, like the 30s, 40s, early 50s classic mid-Atlantic accent where, an ingenue might say, well, whatever would we do? I don't know how we could possibly do that. I mean, we don't talk like that anymore. But there may be an homage to that. I mean, this is the joy of the accents class, is that you can pull things out of history and pull things out of caricature and tone them down. Do you see things over time? And I'm throwing you a softball because of your library of resources. Do you think things change over time, Jim?
Oh, absolutely. It's let me say, things change irregardless of how Dan feels about it.
Irregardless
and irrespective.
So language changes, and so the reason I used irregardless is irregardless was actually existed in literature and language easily back into the 1800s. So the idea that this is a new misuse of that word is actually not historically accurate. If it's a misuse of that word, it doesn't mean that I'm saying you have to like it, but that use of that word has existed for a long time. So recognizing that it's changed, I think they're changing all the time. So that's one thing. The other thing that I'll say is, even though they've changed over time, sometimes what you have to do is not what is historically accurate. You need to do what tells the story best and what meets the audience's expectations. So right now I'm coaching a stage production of Shakespeare in Love. And if we were doing it and it were the time of Shakespeare, the characters would actually speak more like this if we were being true to that time period. But because we're trying to tell the story, most importantly, the characters are much more along this line in the way that they speak, rather than doing it more the way that it probably was spoken at the time of William Shakespeare.
So how can you possibly know this? There were no, as far as I know, even chiseling into the walls of caves to record audio wasn't available at that. How do we know what people sounded like in the 1700s or the 1600s, the late 1600s into the early 1700s when Shakespeare was actually writing? How do we know these things?
Well, I will say I'm not the one who figured it out. I'm just the one who's read some of this stuff and gone to workshops, and I've done work on it, but I'm not the one who originated. So somebody who's really popularized what is now coming to be called original pronunciation for Shakespeare. It's a linguist, David Crystal, and he did a deep dive into rhyming schemes of words at the time and various written sources, comments that people made in diaries and other writings that commented on the way that people pronounce things, and worked out these various pronunciations that are the sort of most likely pronunciations of the time in and around London. And so those sorts of things, ways that people have recorded it in their writing, and then hints that exist, especially in rhyming, those are the things that have added up to certain linguists being able to pull the information that they need to reconstruct the thought of what likely was during that time, which we can't know because Dan wasn't there to carve it into the stone.
Oh no, he was.
Well, I was busy.
He was very busy. Very busy. So I'm just sitting here thinking it would be a great smackdown between you and Mignon Fogarty, Grammar Girl, just talking about language and words and everything. It's just awesome. We're here talking with Jim Johnson, Dan O'Day. They both teach, mostly Jim, but Dan's there as well. They both teach the accents class, which is open for registration right now. I've got a special deal for you. If you act before Tuesday night at 9 p.m. and you register at voheroes.com/accents. Dan will pay the first $300. Jim will chuckle vociferously. We've got a question from Jim, not that Jim. And if you have questions, please put them in the comments below. Those of you, wherever you're watching, YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, they come to us and we can pick them up. Are there any techniques you can use to help switch between accents quickly and accurately? You've got two people talking in a scene, you're doing an audiobook or you're doing some other production, an explainer video, who knows. And all of a sudden, one person has one accent, the other person has the other accent, and you're narrating it. Anything that you can do other than stopping and doing an edit later on?
Initially what you want to do is you want to focus on one character and feel like you have gotten the accent for that character, and you have also gotten just the character as a whole, and recognize that it's a full being that you need to embody, and it's not just a voice that you're putting on. So recognizing that and then working on the other one. And then a couple of things that I would suggest. One of them is make sure that you're taking the breath in for the character that you're about to speak as opposed to, there, I finished that line, I take a breath in, and now I'm switching to the other character. You need to think about your in-breath being related to the character who's about to speak, because that will change your thought, basically. So that's going to make a big difference. Because if it is voiceover, the glorious thing is that you can do certain physical actions that may help you. Like one of the big keys that I use all the time for various intonations, various musicality of accents, is to physicalize it, because oftentimes that helps people to get it. And so physicalizing that little element that is a prompt for you to be able to do that accent as opposed to this other accent that someone's going to do, finding this accent through that different physical action, that's going to be a helpful element. But along that line, I've both been in and performed as a one-person show, and also directed and coached a variety of these. And it becomes a full physical switch that has to happen. So even if you are in a chair or standing doing your voiceover work, making sure that it's not just a voice change, but it's actually a full body change that you're doing, that's going to be significant. Yeah.
Great. I sit there and I wonder if those changes are something that we worry a little too much about. You know, we want to, especially in audiobooks, we want to make sure that we are not leaving any gaps between when people speak. And as a performer, I would urge people to understand that we don't talk over each other all the time. There are times when we take a moment and let something land, or we take a moment and we consider what was just said, or we're stunned by something. It depends entirely on the process and the story that's kind of reeling out. So I would say, worry about it when it happens, but it may not happen. It may not be the moment where you actually need to switch immediately into either a different accent or a non-accented neutral narrator character, or a character that doesn't really have or has your accent, right? The next question, by the way, if you have questions, put them in the comments below. We'd love to do that. Shamtal says, how do you start the process? First steps. How do you start the process working with actors who may be unfamiliar with a particular accent or dialect? So somebody who's never tackled the Eastern Mongolian accent, where do you begin with their journey to become an Eastern Mongolian accent master?
So I will say you've chosen an example that's really pretty extreme. What I will say is, if I'm working with someone,
you're free to ignore that choice if you'd like.
What I tend to do is try to start with somebody by figuring out what they do know, and if it truly is a case where they know nothing, which is pretty rare, there's usually some semblance of it, some sense of it. I actually want to hear their take on it in the beginning so that I can narrow down to go, oh, okay, here are the things that we need to work on. Let's talk through this and let's talk through this. So part of it, especially if I'm working with somebody for the first time, is that oftentimes there's some context that we have to give. And this is part of what I cover in the very first session of the accents class, is trying to give a number of different framing concepts for, cool, let's talk about this. I have some of these things on the wall behind me. Let's talk about the vowel quadrilateral, which all sounds fancy, and you look at it and it's frightening and it's scary. And it's like, wait a minute. No, here's the basic concept that is there. If you get the basic concept, it creates a framework for everything else that I'm going to talk about here in a moment. And I use that same thing when I'm coaching a 7-year-old to do an accent versus when I'm working with an adult actor. So I will oftentimes pull that out and explain just a brief conceptual thing, and they go, oh, okay, this helps me to get context now for the thing you're about to talk about. And I do a description and I have them try it out. We go a little bit back and forth and go, cool, that's exactly what we're looking for. And so then the danger zone is if an actor is in the mode of, I don't get it. That's the worst place to be. And that's where I want to go, well, I'll pick something that they clearly get. And I go, so do you get this? Well, yeah, I get that. Well, then, and I'm working to get them out of the mode of, I don't get it, in this big overview thing, and trying to narrow it down to, what do you not get? Because if you can narrow it down to specific elements you don't understand, we can explain those and we can deal with those and we can get those into action. But if you're in the mode of, I don't get it, as this overview thing, then we're screwed. It's just not going to happen. We've got to get beyond that general sensation and get specific.
I've never seen Jim totally screwed. I mean, I haven't been watching Jim carefully on the webcam that I have planted in his office recently, but I've never seen him actually do this. He tends to meet people. No, he doesn't tend to meet people. He does meet people where they are. He meets actors where they are, where they're comfortable. I've watched it happen over and over and over again. As actors, you can be very technical about things. Maybe that appeals to you, or maybe you're very earthy and organic about things. Maybe that appeals to you. Maybe you know what the internet or the international phonetic alphabet is, and you know what rhotic means, and you know where placement occurs, and you understand the construction of the throat and the voice box and the larynx and all that, or you don't. And it doesn't really matter, because Jim will find where you are and meet you there. Dan, I'm imagining that the first time you watched Jim teach somebody something, it was as amazing to you as it was to me.
Yeah, the very first time part of me was sitting there feeling the same thing that many students feel the first time they volunteer for coaching, which is, gosh, I hope Jim can help them, or not that the performer's bad, but I just hope Jim can work well with this guy, or I hope this guy or gal can understand his direction. And it was very quickly that I realized, all the cues come from the performer when Jim works with them. He listens to what they're doing, and he also watches them, which I find fascinating. He will literally, at times, if somebody does it gets closer to the accent they're trying to do, and they do something physically different. If they raise their hand when they say a word, Jim will point that out and say, okay, whenever you're lost, what I want you to do, go like that, say that word, see what happens. And it's actually called Hebbian connections, is the part of the brain where one thing triggers another. So there you have two memories, but you're not thinking about them. But then something triggers one of them, and automatically that triggers the next. And that's what I see happening when Jim coaches.
Yeah, it's great. And if you're talking about getting coached yourself, getting not just the basics, but very advanced and very widespread training in accents, from accents and dialects all across the United States, the UK, around the world, various areas and regions. One of the things that's really interesting is that Jim provides, in addition to the live training that's going to be occurring starting Monday, by the way, So if you want in, get in now and save the $300 by tomorrow night. Go to voheroes.com/accents. When he does the training on a weekly basis, that's one part of it. The other part of it, which, personally, I think is a steal, an absolute bargain, is Jim can't sit still. Okay? Jim gets in his VW bug van, whatever it is. He just goes around the country and around the world, recording people talking to him in English without trying to have a general American accent. So if he goes to Croatia, he'll have a local Croatian older man, older woman, younger man, child, etc. Talk to him and be interviewed by him, and then he takes and records them, and then he takes back what he has to his secret lair, his laboratory, and he breaks everything down and shares with you how to recreate that, not just as examples, which you can get from YouTube videos. You go, here's how to do that. Okay, great. Imitate me. That's not it. It's understanding how to construct things so that you don't have to say, okay, the line is, now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. Say that for me so I can imitate it. No, how do words that begin with the letter N and continue on with the O, the ow in the word now, how are those constructed in Croatia when they're trying to speak English? And you get this library that is just packed with not only accents and dialect examples and training from around the world, but across the country, across the United States, across the UK. Jim, how many different accents? Like when somebody says, "Oh yeah, I do a British accent," how many different British accents have you encountered, counted? Are there considered to be, including different Scottish accents, different Irish, different Welsh? What is the number that you've come up with?
Well, oh boy, I don't know. Here's the issue: is anytime that you're looking at an accent. So for me, the process of working on it is I start with the way that an individual speaks is called an idiolect. So that's not just me referring to Dan, the way that Dan speaks, but an idiolect is the way that a single individual speaks. And so when I'm looking at an accent or a dialect, we're looking at grouping together the way that a number of different people who have a shared quality speak. And we can do really broad groupings, like this is an American accent, but we all know that's a really, really broad British accent. That's way too broad. So then it becomes about, okay, so how narrow to do this or how broad to do this? This is a choice I've had to make over and over again with the accent materials that I create. How broad and how narrow to do it, because you'll get variations within a family. I'm from a town originally of 900 people in Northwest Iowa. So I'm from a very small town, and there are variations in the accents of my hometown, let alone when you start to look at significant ranges of portions of the country. So it's all about how narrow and how broad to make it, and then finding what are the commonalities that they have that indicate, oh, I am from here. And how precise do you need to get with whatever the project is that you're working on, while recognizing the other thing that's really important is telling the story and making sure that you are clear and understandable.
Yeah,
so,
it's interesting. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so I don't think I'm answering your question quite, because
no, you did.
Okay.
You did.
I'll take that.
It's interesting because I grew up in Ohio, and people kind of lump all of the states that aren't on the coasts into one big area, like, oh, Midwest accent. And when you think about the differences between a Wisconsin accent and a Great Lakes accent, like Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, Rochester, Erie, and an accent that is as close to accent free as possible in the Nebraskas and the Iowas and that area. But then you zero in on Indiana, right? Northern Indiana, above I-80, is very Great Lakes-ish, cars in the driveway and whatnot. But then you get south of 80, and all of a sudden they're Appalachian. They're like, they've got these southern things going on. It's like, what happened? Did we get invaded? What went on here? So VOHeroes.com/accents. You can put your question in the comments below. I think we may have. Oh, Dan has. Did you put that in there, Dan?
I did, yeah. Apparently, the system that we're using, StreamYard, believes that I'm pretty much the entire accents class. So when I post
Wow.
something,
That just shows you how completely clueless
yeah,
StreamYard's impression of you
yeah.
is. Let me just get a real quick question in here. Again, you ask questions in the comments, you'll come up first, but this was sent in by Chris. How do you maintain consistency in an accent or dialect throughout a performance or a project? And this is kind of allied to a question that I get a lot, which is how do you maintain consistency in performance in general? Like, I'm in chapter 2 and I'm doing a character like this. How do I maintain that consistency in chapter 9? And the answer that I give is you may not have to, because likely the story has an arc and it's changed and the performance is going to be based on the story. But what say you, Jim Johnson?
No, I agree with that to a degree. There's a degree of also recognizing each individual. We change the way that we speak depending on who we're talking to. So we have degrees of code switching that we do. I'm in this mode. I'm in professional mode. I'm in hanging out with my friends kind of mode. Oh, I'm back talking with my family, so I'm going to talk more like this. How is it, like the different modes that I will go through? It's very possible that a character would do that. And at the same time, what I'll say is how to keep like the accent or the dialect consistent is the same way that you've got to keep the character consistent. It's a part of, it's not a separate thing. It's a part of it. Kind of along that line, one of the things that I don't care for is when people get into a process on something and then go, okay, now let's add the accent. It's like, wait a minute, what are you doing developing a character without having the accent be a part of developing that character?
So let me just jump on that real quick and clarify. Yeah. This is great because we think about physicality. We think about the way, Kevin Spacey talked about the way Kaiser Soze walked, the way people were carried, the way John Hurt carried himself as the Elephant Man. We talk about the physicality of things. We talk about the wardrobing or the makeup of things affecting the character and how they move and how they speak and how they act with others. And I would think that a lot of people think you add the accent last, but what you're saying is you're putting the scene on its feet. You're putting the lines out there. Why not start with how they're saying? So you're not training yourself to say the lines the way you do or the way you would without the accent. You're saying bring that into the process earlier. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And recognize that it's a whole picture. It's the full thing. When I'm doing, so I've done some voiceover for anime. When I'm doing a character, it's not just the voice that I'm focused on. I stand differently in the studio when I'm doing this character versus when I'm doing another one. It completely affects the way that I behave and move. And to the idea of separating those things is it's not going to work nearly as well. Yeah.
Yeah. We have a question from Michael Ehrenberg, one of my VO Heroes pros. Hey, Michael. What makes one better at one accent but challenged on others?
Yeah, there's so some of it can be familiarity, like having an example that you have heard that is a recognizable example of that is a frame of reference for you. That can make a huge positive difference. Having something that's fairly close to something that you've done before but not too close can sometimes help, because you can go, oh wait, I'm just tweaking a couple of things. But there are also what I like to call speed bump accents. In general, what I'll say is usually learning sort of a first new accent that you're taking on is oftentimes one of the more challenging ones. And the second one is maybe just a little bit easier. And the third one, just a little bit easier. And as you start to gather more of them that you feel capable of, it tends to get easier and easier, except for speed bump accents, where you kind of hit this real problem spot, which for me, for example, one that was a bit of a nightmare for a long time was South African accents.
South Africa.
Really trying to deal with those, and that I needed to be able to deal with it even conceptually. Like the way that I really found my way in was understanding a lot more about the history and the context for different speakers. And then once I could get that mental frame of reference, it really helped me to start to go, okay, now let me look at this smaller grouping. And that's what gave me a road into that. But that was a speed bump accent for me, for example.
You may not remember this, but a couple of years ago when we were talking about accents and dialects here live on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn, you actually helped me with that. And what we discussed and sort of explored was the history of the settlement of South Africa and how Dutch and English kind of combine to create a lot of the, and then I also think of Deborah Patta on CBS and how she reports things, and that just helps me out. But so familiarity is one thing. Is it also where you've kind of traveled in your life, where you've been exposed to things and you have a greater base of experience?
Yeah, I think it's both where you've like literally traveled physically, but it's also where you've traveled mentally. Because I mean, we kind of keep coming back to character. Is you have to transform to be able to take something on, and recognizing that if you've been one of those people who screwed around in front of the mirror when you were a kid, which is I think most people to some degree, like playing with different voices, those kinds of explorations make a huge difference. There's this magic age that linguists talk about that is basically 14. That if you move somewhere before you turn 14, where another language is spoken or where at least the accent is quite different, you are likely to take on that new language, that new accent as a native speaker, depending on some other elements. But if you move thereafter, you're less likely to make that full transformation. But a lot of it's also about identity. Like I've got a couple of recordings of New Yorkers who moved to Texas. One of them had been in Texas for about 3 years, and the other one had been in Texas for about 17 years. The one who'd been in Texas for 17 years, funnily enough, sounded much more like a New Yorker. But that's because that person was still like, I'm a New Yorker. I'm living in Houston, but this is not me. Whereas the other one was like, I was so glad to get out of New York and be in Houston. This was where I wanted to be. And those two people, the one who'd been here a shorter time, actually had transformed a great deal more because it was about identity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking with Jim Johnson and Dan O'Day. The Accents class is open for registration right now. You can save $300 if you're watching this anytime before Tuesday night at 9 o'clock. That's when it changes and goes up to full price. So go check it out at voheroes.com/accents. I want to ask as a point of personal privilege, if I might, does it get easier as you get older, or does it get harder as you get older to acquire the basics of multiple accents, or just an accent in general that you need for, like, do people that are my age have to set aside more time, or is it on an individual basis?
You mean elderly people? Is that?
Yeah. Elderly.
Well,
people,
are we talking
Dan.
about Dan, or are we talking about you, David? Elderly.
Well, my walker is just off camera, so pick your poison.
And I'm going to make a guess before Jim answers. We've never talked. That's a great question. I've never heard it before. My guess is, in general, the older, assuming you have accrued experience along the way, the older and the more experienced you are, the easier I would think it would be to learn something new. Jim, you want to give the correct answer now?
Well, let me try to correct you then, Dan. I think it's a little bit more individual, and it's individual experience. If somebody does like what I'm going to say Dan said a little bit of something right, which is that if you have this accrued experience and you have experience with some other languages, you've done a, you know, speak a little bit of Spanish, so you had to maybe learn a slightly different R than what you grew up speaking. When you're acquiring these different sounds that you get used to and you make those shifts, that keeps doors open or opens new doors. Now, I don't think that it's people cannot get it. And a lot of times it tries to get attributed to just, do you have a good ear? It's not just, do you have a good ear? It's also, can you conceive? I'm trying to work with people on multiple levels. Like you pointed out, I'm watching the way that people physicalize something, because a physical movement is going to be one of the ways in. The auditory of hearing it and trying to speak it is going to be another way in. But there's also a visual that's seeing something, whether it's a conceptual visual like the phonetics, the vowels and such, or if it's a visual of a watching someone demonstrate something physically where you've got a visual to go with that. The more routes that you can get to these different kinds of learning modes, which we all have different ones that are strengths, and usually it's multiple ones. But the more sort of learning modes that you can engage, the more likely that you are to get something. And we're constantly trying in this work to make this sort of brain, ear, mouth connection, so that one of them from moment to moment may be the stronger route in, but then something else helps to get there. And right along that line, one of the things that I'm trying to do is not just listen for where somebody does something wrong, but I'm trying to listen for where somebody gets something right, like where something is like, hey, something just kicked in there. Let's figure out what was the path into that. And so part of what I'll do in that moment is try to help them to identify it by saying, tell me, what did you do there? And then when they give that descriptive, well, hey, it was a darker sound for me there. Great. Can you find that dark sound and move it over here? And I don't care how you describe it. If that is a route in that you go, that language works for me, that image works for me, then I want to steal that. And not only am I asking you so that you can get clearer on it, but I'm trying to ask you because the way that you describe it, that may be different from the way that I describe it, may be the route in for somebody else who's in the class with you.
And talking about the physicalization of the learning process, one thing that I find kind of fascinating is, especially when someone is beginning on a new accent and Jim is coaching them in class, is, as we've already mentioned, often there is some kind of physicality that accompanies it. So somebody's trying to pronounce a word or give a sentence and they go like that and it works. I would say 60% of the time, they are not consciously aware that they changed their physicality. And Jim will say, well, you know, when you said that sentence, you went like this. Try that again, see if that actually does help. And once he points it out, it becomes real easy. But when we physicalize things without trying to, by definition, we're not conscious of it. So, but having it pointed out really helps.
You know, it's interesting. There are so many things you can take classes on online anymore, and the way they talk about the connections that will be built. If you take a class on gaming, a class on streaming on Twitch or gaming, you're going to get an eye-hand coordination connection. And if you take a course on guided meditation, you're going to get a head-heart connection. Not with Jim. With Jim, you get a brain-ear-mouth connection. That's the connection that you get. All right, we're wrapping up here in a few minutes. So if you have questions, please put them in the comments below. We'll get in as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. Raj asks, and he's asking for a little peek behind the curtain in the Jim Johnson process for the accents class. How do you approach researching and practicing a new accent or dialect? And if you could, Jim, let me treat you like your Chat GPT. Could you explain this from the perspective of you as a coach, as well as me as an actor? Is there a difference in how I should approach this, or how Raj should approach this versus how you might approach this with the training that you have as a linguistics professor?
And I'm not a linguistics professor. I would
Yes,
never
you are.
I work in the periphery. I work within the realm of it, but I would never say that that's what I am.
What are you? What kind of professor are you?
I don't know.
Well, you're a professor. You're a theater professor.
I am. Yeah, I am. I'm just somebody who's been lucky to get my 10,000 hours or whatever in doing this stuff and doing it over and over again and being enough of a geek and having enough people keep telling me to do it. So
how do you approach this process?
So I start by listening and listening and listening. And what is really, so it's a little different for me than what it is for when I'm teaching it, like the process. You asked for sort of these two perspectives on it. I start through listening and listening and listening and creating my descriptions. And I'm constantly using frame of reference of, okay, this is similar to that. And so I make notes about, there is an intonation in this that is similar to an intonation that is present in this other accent. So that starts to give me some context. How is it different? How can I figure out where it's different in the intonation, the musicality of it? Simultaneously, I'm also doing breakdowns of phonetics. So I will say, well, I'm just going to continue with my perspective before I talk about the actor's perspective. So I'm going to really do a breakdown in detailed phonetics, and where I'm listening for certain words and the sounds that occur in those words. And then I'm also working on the concept of placement, that feeling of the oral posture or the mouth posture. Where does it feel like the sound sort of lives in the mouth? So I'm trying to create that breakdown. And then anything that I feel like, then I'm listening through lots of conversations and such, and I'm trying to track, where is there anything where I can hear that I'm off, or where there's a variation that I'm like, where's this variation coming from? What is it that's the cause of it? Because sometimes it's about these little tiny details. Like Dan earlier said this thing, something like about, that Canadian about, and the recognition that it's about the ow diphthong, but it's different when it's before an unvoiced consonant versus a voiced consonant. And this is the level of geekdom that you don't have to get into necessarily, but it's the level of geekdom that I have to dive into. Then when I'm teaching it, I really want to start with placement and intonation, because oftentimes the placement is what gets someone to get the sounds in the right place. And sometimes the intonation is the way into that as well. And so that's what oftentimes results in the sounds being the sounds that we're after. But I don't want to start with the sounds. And I don't care if you know phonetics. You don't need to know all these weird little symbols and what they represent. There are concepts behind them that are essential. And then we can get to the, okay, where is this in the mouth? Let's get to the shape of that. And so the route in for me is a little bit different than the route in is for the actor. And I will also say the route for the actor, I constantly have to readjust it depending on what works for somebody. Yep. So it's about, that path isn't quite working, so let's try this. And the path isn't working doesn't mean there's something wrong with you, the actor. It means that just wasn't opening up as quickly and easily as another route might. So let's find another route. And yeah, and sometimes there's a blockage. And that's where I've got to sort of we got to have a little bit of a come to Jesus chat about, okay, let's figure out what this blockage is that is getting in the way of this happening right now. And how do we take a step back from that and find another route? How do we let that go and find a whole different journey towards it that oftentimes has so much of a faster payoff?
Yeah. We talked earlier about the sort of materials that Jim develops as he's doing this study, as he's getting into things. The library of materials. One of the videos I put out last week was sort of a screenshot of me scrolling through all of the different accents and dialects materials that you provide in the library. But I think what's missing there, and I think what a lot of people may not have seen in that email, if they caught it, was the fact that I took the course 4 years ago, something like this.
3 or 4.
And what was that, Dan?
Yeah, 3 or 4 is exactly.
Yeah. And to this day, I'm still getting email from Jim saying, here's the update on the Italian, because I just went to Italy and I engorged myself on pasta and listened to people speaking English with an Italian accent. Here are the updated materials. Download these materials. And it's MP3 files and PDF files and explanations as well as examples. And it's like, he won't leave me alone. It's like he won't leave you alone either, which is an amazing investment. If you do this class, it's certainly worth the money. And with the $300 off before tomorrow night, it's even a bigger steal. But then you get these ongoing materials from him. You don't expect them to be coming, but he can't stay still in Houston where he lives. He's off, he was here a few years ago. We went to lunch because he was recording Southern California tinged, and let me make sure I'm getting this right, Southern California tinged Hispanic accents in English, which are very different from Texas tinged Hispanic or Arizona or New Mexico or Wisconsin, who knows? But it's like he just provides such an amazing set of resources, not just now if you take the course with the live training and the materials that you get in the course, but ongoing. And then the other thing I want to share with you is he is going to be working one-on-one with those of you who deign to ask, some of you who deign to ask in class, to be dealt with in person, live, during the class. And that can be a
in case anyone is a little confused, this is via a live Zoom session.
Yeah, which can be a transformative moment for you as an actor. If you've never had the level of coaching that Jim engages in, you feel like that one acting coach that made all the difference for you in turning the dial, 2 clicks to the right to make it all fall into place. That's just like one of those moments, and I'll never forget that moment for me with Jim in the course. It's just joyous. So if you want to add accents and dialects to your acting quiver, to your acting toolkit, this is far and away the best, and despite the price, the most economical and valuable approach you can take. I got an email today from somebody who, we may have a couple final questions here. I'm just going to check.
There's one from Ricky Bryce that sounds interesting.
Yeah, I'll get that. Yeah. I had an email from somebody today who's like, yeah, you know what, David, I just went on YouTube and I just watched other people doing this and it was fine. Too much money. I can't spend that kind of money. And I'm like, great. What kind of feedback did you get from those people on YouTube? What kind of, sort of circle was there of here's you doing it, here's an adjustment, here's you doing it better, here's another adjustment, here's you doing it awesome. Did that happen for you on YouTube? You get what you pay for. And in this case, what you get far exceeds what you'll be paying for. So Nikki says, so I had an audition for English speaking German dialect. Will I be able to figure out how to do the sides with just the info in the class? And I had one last question that I was going to ask along these lines, and that is, when you're presented with an audition that is due at 5 o'clock that day, and it includes an accent, how do you speed up the process using what you learn in class so that you can get the most out of the time that you have? So if you could answer Nikki's question and then completely ignore my question, that would be great.
Well, I'll say that in the class sessions, we don't specifically work on German during those video sessions, but I send you German materials that follow it up. I do talk about commonalities. And in fact, one of the things that we have is we work on French in class, and we have to commonly talk about, okay, here's this German element that keeps pulling you towards Germany here. How do we keep it from going there in order to keep it French? And so recognizing, oh, this is that pull that pulls it in that direction. I will say there's another video that I do about how to do all ESL or EFL foreign language or second language accents, because in general, figure out what the R sound is. Sorry, this is maybe overwhelming information, but you figure out what the R sound is, but then potentially mostly the sounds are the same for most ESL, EFL accents outside of that. And then it becomes about placement and intonation. And the reason that we do the accents that we do in class, it's largely about we're trying to build a toolkit where we go, this intonation that is a familiar intonation for you now because we've worked on it, this is also present in this accent and this accent and this accent. So it's about this building this toolkit of a little bit of plug and play. Okay, this is very much like this accent, so I'm going to carry it over here. So that's what I'll say about it, is you'll have specific materials that work on the German accent, but we're also trying to build you up to going, oh, okay, it's this element, I got to bring it to it. And that's what also I think helps to make it happen in this quicker version. You figure out, for example, the physicalization of that specific intonation for that accent, and then you put that in action and head towards your taping, because it's
when Jim talks about intonation, aka the melody of the dialect, to me, when I learned that, it just opened up an entire world that I did not know existed. And there are so many accents that really are have the same melody. It's just a different pitch, perhaps, slightly different changes. And I bring this up because someone brought up German and Jim said French. If you haven't noticed this before, I certainly did not ever pick up on this. The intonation, or the melody, so to speak, of French and German, they are virtually identical. I mean, they are so close. It's just, what do you do, especially at the end of a sentence and other places? But I never spotted that. But then when Jim explained it, showed me, now I can't get away from it. I hear somebody speaking French and I realize, if they just did this at the end of the sentence, I would think they were German. And it's all because of the melody or the intonation.
Nikki follows up with, that is what I mean. If I just read the German info in March 2024, as that's when German is sent out, can I get it from the videos and documents? So let me clarify this. You get a complete library of the current information, and eventually Jim will head to Heidelberg or take a cruise on the Rhine or whatever, and he will update them. And it's very much a lovely surprise when they show up, because you don't know where he's been, because he doesn't send out a note going, well, I'm headed over to Mississippi now. So that's actually what the joy of this is you get the building blocks that you can use, and then you get this additional information that shows you how to install crown molding as you put up the walls. Now you get to do all the little final work, which is just awesome. This has been terrific. This is like every time I get together with Jim, not so much with Dan, but with Jim, it's just a really awesome situation. This is a 4-week live class, recorded, obviously, if you can't make a particular class because you're very, very busy being a top of show guest star on a series. Great, there's recordings. But this is an opportunity to really do things the right way, not the easy, cheap way, I'll do my best impression of something, but really to learn how to let it find purchase in your acting set of skills. Jim's amazing. I find it one of the most fortunate things in my life to have been exposed to what he does and how he does it. He has been responsible for a lot of income for me in terms of being able to both audition for and, for some god-awful reason, get booked on things that required accents and dialects. I happen to be someone who's fascinated with this sort of work, so I may be a little bit more about it. But I would urge those of you who aren't, those of you who think you don't have the facility for this, or you've been told you don't have the facility for this, or you've told yourself, oh, I'm not all that good at this sort of thing. I'm not, I'm a accents and dialect. Or if you find yourself avoiding auditions and avoiding potential work because it contains accents and dialects, how cool would it be if you could change the answer to that from I'm not going anywhere near that to, oh yeah, let's see what I can do with this, right? And that's what the accents class will do for you. So one last time, voheroes.com/accents. If you register for class, it's open right now. If you're watching this on the replay, as long as you get over there before Tuesday night, March 29th, which is the day after we're recording this, by 9 p.m. Pacific, Dan is going to somehow grit his teeth and pay the first $300 of the course. I put the link in the comments. It's also on your screen, voheroes.com/accents. Any last words, gentlemen, before we wrap things up?
Yeah. Thank you for making my week, because as you know, for some reason, I am calendar challenged. You know, if only they would put the days of the week in order, that would help. But I'm forever writing down the wrong time, for example. I did it for our session today. My point being, Tuesday is the 28th.
Oh, the 28th. Okay. Thank you.
And,
so it's Tuesday.
And
Just
I
to be
don't have any
clear,
pleasure in correcting David in front of.
no, it's Tuesday. It's Tuesday. I was looking at your chart here. It is Tuesday, whether it's the 29th or the 28th, which it actually is. If you live in my world, it may not be, but in everybody else's world, it's the 28th. Because today is not the 20th, it's the 27th as we're recording this. All right, so tomorrow night, as we're recording this, Tuesday night, that's your deadline. Don't be a deadline dancer. Take advantage of this, because Dan's a cheap bastard, and to get $300 out of him will give you some joy that you may not ever experience again in life. Jim Johnson, thank you so much for your time today. Dan, I appreciate you being here as well. I'm not going to thank you for your time because, yeah, no. But voheroes.com/accents. I'm David H. Lawrence, the 17th. I thank you so much for watching and for listening, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.